She borrowed her little sister's boots on a sunny afternoon, climbed onto a bicycle, and rode toward a horse stable she would never reach. The evidence that would one day name her killer was on those boots the entire time, a microscopic stain that sat in a storage room for 36 years while a family buried two parents without answers, while a killer lived 5 miles away and ran a ceramics shop and went to casinos and grew old, while a 12-year-old girl became a 60-year-old woman still fighting for her sister's name. This is the story of Jodie Lumis. And it begins and ends with a pair of borrowed boots. If you are new to True Crime Traces, hit that subscribe button right now, tap the like button, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. You do not want to miss a single case on this channel, and this one is going to stay with you. It was August 23, 1972. Bothell, Washington. The sun was still high at 5 in the afternoon, the kind of late summer light that stretches the day out and makes everything feel unhurried and safe. A 20-year-old woman named Jodie Lumis pulled on her little sister Jana's waffle stomper boots, walked out to the driveway, and wheeled a white 10-speed bicycle onto the road. She was heading to a horse stable 6 miles northeast of home. She kept a horse named Saudi there. She rode regularly. She usually drove to get there. That afternoon, for whatever reason only she knew, she decided to take the bicycle instead. It was the first time she had ever made that choice. It would be the last ride she ever took. Jodie lived at 20 Winesap Road in unincorporated Snohomish County with her parents, her fiancé Jim Roberts, and her 12-year-old sister Jana. The area is part of Mill Creek now, a developed suburb with traffic lights and strip malls and the ordinary noise of modern life. But in 1972 it was something else entirely: dirt roads, horse properties, wide stretches of open land with long gaps between houses. The kind of place where a young woman could pedal for miles through wooded stretches and not pass another living soul. Her route took her along Penny Creek Road. Wooded on both sides. Quiet. Almost no traffic in the late afternoon. The kind of road that feels peaceful until it doesn't. Near the midpoint of the ride, a dirt track branched off Penny Creek Road and pushed back into dense forest. That track was not on Jodie's route. She had no reason to go down it. But someone was waiting near it. And that is where her afternoon ended. Around 5:30 that same evening, a young couple drove up that same dirt track to do some target shooting in the woods. They were not looking for anything except cans to knock over with a rifle on a warm summer evening. What they found instead was a woman lying on the ground in the trees. She was mostly undressed. She had been sexually assaulted. Above her right ear was a gunshot wound from a .22 caliber pistol. She was still breathing, but she was not responding to anything around her. She could not speak. She could not move. She was alive in the most fragile and temporary sense of the word. The couple did not stop to deliberate. They picked her up, carried her to their car, and drove 15 minutes west at speed to Stevens Memorial Hospital in Edmonds. They put a dying woman in their back seat and they drove. They did not stop to cover her. There was no time for anything except movement. Jodie Lumis was pronounced dead on arrival. The couple who found her and carried her out of those woods, their names were never released to the public. They had done everything right. And the world never knew who they were. Investigators arrived at the scene on Penny Creek Road and began reconstructing what had happened in those trees. The picture that took shape was brutal and methodical. Jodie had been forced off the road at gunpoint. She had been taken deep into the forest under threat of violence. She had been sexually assaulted. The gunshot wound above her right ear had been fired as she tried to dress herself afterward. It was the cause of death. Not an accident. Not a struggle that went wrong. A deliberate act. Her white 10-speed bicycle was still on the dirt track where she had been intercepted, right where she had been forced to stop. Her clothing was recovered at the scene. Everything was catalogued and sealed and transported to evidence storage at the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, including the waffle stomper boots she had borrowed from her 12-year-old sister Jana that afternoon. In the days that followed, deputies canvassed the surrounding area and began looking at the men in the local community. A few drew attention. One was a ranch owner who had previously behaved inappropriately toward Jodie, the kind of conduct that neighbors had noticed and talked about but never formally reported to anyone in a position to do something about it. Another was a tenant on a nearby property who had been chopping wood close to the dirt track that afternoon and could not clearly account for his whereabouts during the relevant window of time. Both were questioned. Others were questioned too. And none of them, not one, could be connected to the crime through physical evidence or witness testimony. There were no fingerprints recovered from the scene. There were no eyewitnesses to the attack itself. There was nothing tangible tying any specific person to what happened in those woods off Penny Creek Road on the afternoon of August 23, 1972. By the end of that year, Snohomish County's newest homicide was already its most frustrating one. There had been a full crime scene. There had been physical evidence collected. There was a dead 20-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her. And there was not a single lead that held up under scrutiny. The evidence went into long-term storage. The file went onto a shelf alongside every other case that had run out of road. The detectives who had worked it moved on to new assignments and new cases that demanded their attention. The machinery of law enforcement moved forward. The Lumis family did not move forward. They could not. Jana Lumis was 12 years old on the afternoon her sister borrowed her boots and never came home. She grew up in the shadow of that single afternoon, watching her parents carry a grief that did not soften with the passing of seasons or the accumulation of years. It simply stayed, the same weight, every morning. Jodie's bedroom remained untouched for a long time after she died. Jana said years later that you could still smell the patchouli oil when you walked in. Jodie's leather purse sat right where she had left it on the last day of her life, as if she had only stepped out for a moment and would be back soon. Jana went from 12 to 20 to 30 to 40. She graduated. She married. She became Jana Lumis Smith. Her parents aged through all those same years carrying the same open wound, calling the sheriff's office periodically for updates that never materialized, because there was genuinely nothing to update. The file was technically still open. But it was not moving. It had not moved in years. Both of Jodie's parents died without ever learning who killed their daughter. They raised a girl. They lost her on a summer afternoon. They spent the remaining years of their lives waiting for an answer. And they died holding the same question they had been asking since 1972. That is not an abstraction. That is the lived reality of what an unsolved murder does to a family. It does not end. It just continues. Jana became the family's voice after her parents were gone. She kept calling detectives. She kept showing up at press conferences whenever the sheriff's office made another push on the case. She refused to allow the file to disappear quietly into a cabinet somewhere and be forgotten. When the case finally began moving again in 2008, she told reporters that she wanted whoever did this to sweat. She wanted them to know that someone was still paying attention. That the world had not moved on just because time had passed. She had been carrying her sister's case for 36 years by that point. Longer than Jodie herself had been alive. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment with the words "I am still here." Let us see who is truly following this story, because what comes next changes everything. In 2005, a cold case detective named Jim Scharf at the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office pulled Jodie's file off the shelf. The case was 33 years old. It was the county's oldest unsolved homicide. Nobody had touched it in years. Scharf was a methodical investigator, the kind of detective who does not look for shortcuts because he knows there are none. He went back through every piece of the original evidence. He re-interviewed anyone he could still locate. He sent anything with potential DNA value to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for modern analysis. 3 years later, in 2008, a crime lab technician examining Jodie's left boot found something that had been sitting there since the night of the murder. A semen stain. On the outside of the boot. Small. Faint. Missed by investigators at multiple agencies across 36 years of handling, cataloging, moving between storage facilities, and examining. It had been there the entire time. In a storage room. Under everyone's nose for 36 years. It took different lighting conditions and modern forensic equipment for a technician to finally see what everyone before them had missed. The technician extracted a partial DNA profile from that stain and submitted it to CODIS, the FBI's national database containing DNA profiles collected from convicted offenders across the country. The principle is straightforward: if the person who left DNA at a crime scene has been convicted of a qualifying offense and submitted a biological sample, the database flags a match. If they have not, it returns nothing. The system only knows about the people already inside it. No match came back on Jodie's case. The man who killed her in 1972 was not in CODIS. That did not necessarily mean he had a clean record. It meant that his offenses either predated the mandatory DNA collection laws that came later, or that they fell outside the specific categories of crime that required a sample to be taken. The partial profile was entered into the database and left to run, automatically comparing itself against every new profile added to the system as people were convicted and processed across the country. Year after year. New entries pouring in. And no match ever came back. Detective Scharf kept the case open through all of it. He continued looking for new angles. He submitted the profile to new databases as they came online. He stayed in regular contact with Jana, calling her with updates even when the honest update was that there was nothing new to report. The file had sat untouched for 33 years before he picked it up. He was not going to let that happen again on his watch. Then in July of 2018, Scharf tried a fundamentally different approach. He sent the DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a private forensic laboratory in Virginia that specializes in a technique called genetic genealogy. This method operates on a completely different principle than CODIS. Rather than matching crime scene DNA against a database of convicted offenders, genetic genealogy uploads a DNA profile to public ancestry platforms like GEDmatch, where millions of ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their own DNA to trace their family histories and connect with distant relatives. If anyone in that ancestry database shares enough DNA with the crime scene sample, it indicates a biological relationship. They are related, however distantly, to whoever left that DNA at the scene. From that starting point, genealogists build a family tree, working outward through generations of births and marriages and deaths and relocations, using every public record they can find, until the branches narrow down toward a living individual. Parabon brought in a genetic genealogist named Deb Stone, based in Oregon. Stone's assignment was to take the distant DNA matches returned by GEDmatch and work backward through time, combing through online family trees, court papers, census records, obituaries, property records, anything available in public databases. She started with second and third cousins of the unknown male and worked her way backward and forward through the generations. She spent 57 hours on that project. 57 hours of methodical, painstaking research threading through generations of a family she had never heard of, in a county she may not have known, trying to find a man whose name appeared nowhere in a 50-year-old case file. The branches of that tree eventually pointed to a family in the Edmonds area of Snohomish County. But genealogy could only point to a family. It could not prove which specific member of that family had walked into a forest off Penny Creek Road on an August afternoon in 1972 and taken a young woman's life. For that, investigators needed something direct. They needed a biological sample from the suspect himself, so the lab could run a side-by-side comparison against the profile extracted from the boot. On August 28, 2018, law enforcement officers followed their person of interest to the Tulip Casino north of Everett. They watched him walk in. They watched him buy a coffee. They watched him sit down at a machine, drink it, and when he was finished, tossed the paper cup into a garbage can. They watched him stand up and walk away without a second thought. After he cleared the area, they moved in and collected the cup. It went straight to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. In September of 2018, the lab delivered what 46 years of investigation had been unable to produce. The DNA profile extracted from that discarded coffee cup matched the DNA profile from the semen stain on Jodie's left boot. The statistical probability that this was a coincidental match, that two unrelated individuals happened to share that profile, was 980 million to 1. After 46 years. After tens of thousands of investigative hours across dozens of detectives and multiple agencies. After a family buried both parents without answers. After a file sat on a shelf for 3 decades before anyone looked at it again. A paper coffee cup thrown into a casino garbage can give them what nothing else could. His name was Terrence Miller. Everyone called him Terry. He was living 5 miles from the crime scene. He had been living 5 miles from the crime scene for 46 years. He had raised a family during those 46 years. He had run a small ceramics business out of his garage with his wife Linda, a shop they called Miller's Cove, a modest operation they kept going for years selling handmade pieces to neighbors and local customers. To the people who knew him, Terry Miller was the ceramics guy. A retired heavy equipment operator. A quiet older man living an ordinary life in Edmonds, Washington. The record attached to his name told a very different story. In 1968, 4 years before Jodie's murder, he had driven a company truck alongside a teenage girl walking alone in Mount Lake Terrace. He called her over to the vehicle. He was naked from the waist down. He admitted the exposure to police when they interviewed him. He was cited for lewd conduct. He was 18 years old when he married his first wife, who was 14. In 1972, the year Jodie was killed, Terry Miller was 33 years old and living in Edmonds with his third wife. He worked as a heavy equipment operator and moved through that community without drawing attention from the people looking for Jodie's killer. His name never appeared in the original investigation. Deputies had been focusing on local men who either knew Jodie or had been seen specifically near the dirt track that afternoon. Miller fit neither description. He was never questioned. His name did not appear on a single list, in a single note, or anywhere in the case file. He had been invisible the entire time. In the decades that followed the murder, accusations of sexual misconduct continued to surface around him. Allegations of molesting a preteen emerged in the mid-1970s. 2 sisters came forward in 1990 reporting that he had touched them inappropriately, but later said the contact may have been accidental, and no charges were filed. In 1999, a man with developmental disabilities reported that Miller had sexually abused him, but prosecutors determined the incident fell outside the statute of limitations and could not be prosecuted. 5 known accusations of sexual misconduct across 3 decades. Not one of them, after that original 1968 citation, resulted in a conviction. When Detective Scharf stood before reporters to announce the arrest, he chose his words carefully and he chose them honestly. He called Terrence Miller a real predator. On April 11, 2019, deputies arrested Terrence Miller at his home in Edmonds. He was 77 years old. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Jodie Lumis. Bail was set at $1 million. He posted it. He went home, back to the same house in Edmonds, the same garage with the ceramics shop, the same neighborhood where he had lived for decades while a family waited for an answer that should have come 47 years earlier. He pleaded not guilty at his arraignment. The trial was delayed by more than a year, partly because of the pandemic that shuttered courts across the country in 2020, and partly because of defense motions challenging the admissibility of the genealogy evidence. In October of 2020, a judge denied the motion to suppress that evidence. The path to trial was clear. Jury selection began in late October of 2020 in Snohomish County Superior Court, before Judge David Kurtz. The trial ran for 2 weeks into early November. Prosecutors built their case entirely around the DNA evidence chain, and they walked the jury through it methodically from beginning to end. They started with the semen stain discovered on the boot in 1972. They moved to the partial DNA profile developed in 2008. Then the Parabon analysis and Deb Stone's 57 hours of genealogy work in 2018. The coffee cup surveillance at the Tulip Casino. The Washington State Patrol Lab confirmation that September. And the 980 million to 1 match that connected a paper cup thrown in a garbage can to a boot that had been sitting in an evidence room for nearly half a century. The defense attacked the chain at every point they could find. The public defenders argued that 5 decades of evidence handling had introduced contamination that made the DNA results fundamentally unreliable. One defender told the jury that the prosecution's entire case rested on what she called a botched DNA analysis of the outside of a boot. The other laid out the specifics, that deputies present at the 1972 autopsy had not worn gloves, that evidence had been lost and unaccounted for during large stretches of the 3 decades between the murder and the first DNA testing. Under cross-examination, prosecution witnesses acknowledged that a Washington State Patrol Crime Lab analyst's own DNA had turned up on a reference sample during testing. The defense argument was clear and it was not frivolous. The boot had been contaminated over the course of 50 years of handling, and the evidence chain was so compromised that no jury could responsibly trust what any laboratory found in it decades later. And then Jana spoke. 48 years after her sister was killed, Jana Lumis Smith stood in that courtroom. She stood before the jury and she stood before the man charged with taking Jodie away from her family. She told the court that for those of us who remain, all we have is the hope of justice and accountability for the hideous theft of Jodie's life. She described what those 46 years had looked like from the inside, the defendant celebrating birthdays and Christmases and every holiday in between, marrying, raising children, living a full life, while her family existed around a hole that never closed and never got smaller. Closing arguments concluded on Friday, November 6, 2020. The jury began deliberating that afternoon and then adjourned for the weekend. They would return Monday morning to continue their work. On Monday morning, November 9, 2020, Terrence Miller was found dead at his home in Edmonds from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Snohomish County medical examiner confirmed it as suicide. He was 78 years old. The jury did not know. At that same moment, 12 people were sitting in a jury room at the Snohomish County Superior Court, working through the evidence, weighing the contamination arguments against the statistical weight of the DNA match, with absolutely no knowledge that the defendant they were deliberating over had already taken his own life that morning. That afternoon, they reached their verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. 12 jurors who did not know the defendant was dead looked at the evidence, listened to the defense's argument that 5 decades of handling had corrupted everything, and decided the chain held. They decided the semen on the boot was Miller's. They decided the coffee cup confirmed it. They decided that Terrence Miller had killed Jodie Lumis in those woods off Penny Creek Road in August of 1972, and that the evidence he left on her sister's borrowed boot was what proved it 48 years later. Miller's defense team filed a motion to vacate the conviction. Their argument was constitutional, because Miller had died before the verdict was read, he had been denied the right to appeal, and the conviction should therefore be erased. Judge Kurtz held a hearing in December of 2020. He heard from the attorneys. He heard from family members on both sides. He took in everything presented to him. Then he ruled against the motion. It was not the right thing to do, Kurtz said, to erase what the jury had found. The conviction stands. Detective Jim Scharf had spent 14 years working that case by the time it reached a resolution. He said after the verdict that he was glad the family got to hear it. That it was good for them. And it was, but it was also the only thing left that the system could give Jana and the surviving members of the Lumis family. Not a sentencing hearing. Not a prison term. Not the image of Terrence Miller being led away in handcuffs to spend whatever years he had left behind a cell door. The man who killed Jodie had taken all of that from the family too, in the end, by choosing the way he left. What remained was this: a verdict from 12 strangers who had sat through 2 weeks of evidence, heard the defense's best arguments, and told the truth about what they found. Jana Lumis Smith was 12 years old when she lent her sister those waffle stomper boots on a sunny afternoon in August. She was 60 years old when the jury said guilty. Both of her parents were gone by then. She heard those words without them. She had carried this case for longer than Jodie had been alive, and she had done it without the two people who understood most completely what had been lost. Jodie Lumis was 20 years old. She had a fiancé who loved her. She had a horse named Saudi waiting for her at a stable she never reached. She had a little sister who adored her and a bedroom that smelled like patchouli oil and a leather purse sitting right where she had left it. She had her whole life ahead of her. And it was just taken away. Just like that. On a sunny afternoon on a quiet road 6 miles from home. And the people who loved her lived with that. Every single day. For 48 years. If this story moved you, if you think Jodie Lumis deserves to be remembered, then please like this video right now and subscribe to True Crime Traces so you never miss another case. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and drop a comment below telling us what you think of the verdict. Should the conviction have stood after Miller's death? We read every comment. We see every name. And we will keep telling these stories for as long as there are families still waiting for the truth to come out.